Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. In this week's special edition of Washington Talk, I sat down one-on-one with John Bolton, who served as the National Security Advisor to former President Donald Trump from April 2018 to September 2019. Ambassador Bolton looked back at the Trump-Kim summit and shared his thoughts on what the Biden administration's North Korean policy should look like. Ambassador, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, glad to be with you.
Let's start with Biden administration's review of North Korean policy. They say they're in the final stage of the review and they're going to finish it soon. What was most notable in the previous Trump administration was so-called top-down diplomacy. Do you think the Biden team should adopt top-down diplomacy as well?
No, I don't think the top-down approach worked, but I don't think the bottom-up approach will work either if the objective is an agreement with Kim Jong-un that relies on him promising to give up his nuclear weapons program in exchange for sanctions relief. I think the regime is committed to developing and keeping nuclear weapons. I think they see it as essential to their survival. And while I think they would welcome any relief from economic sanctions, as multiple times in the past, they've demonstrated they're not going to give up the nuclear program voluntarily.
Mm-hmm. So the top-down diplomacy, you think it didn't work at all?
Well, I think it was good for photo opportunities, and I think that's primarily what President Trump saw in it for him. It was clear that Kim Jong-un was willing to trade promises to reduce the nuclear program to get relief from the economic sanctions. But I think we persuaded President Trump that those promises were not good enough. In fact, it has been the case repeatedly that North Korea has promised to give up its nuclear program in exchange for upfront economic benefits. And yet when the benefits are provided, somehow the nuclear program never goes away. And we thought it was important that President Trump not fall prey to that same kind of trap. And he didn't. But the summit diplomacy, I think, gave the Kim Jong-un regime more legitimacy than it should have, and we got nothing in return.
Mm-hmm. Some experts say, but the top-down diplomacy has its own merits because the North Korean negotiators, they don't have a say in the nuclear weapons. So it could be more practical or more effective if the North Korean leader himself comes out to the talks. What do you say to that?
Well, it depends on what the policy is of the regime from top to bottom. And I don't have any doubt Kim Jong-un basically sets that policy. And I think he was pursuing the same policy his father and his grandfather pursued, and that is they want nuclear weapons. So if they had made a strategic decision to give up the pursuit of nuclear weapons, to renounce the whole concept, then I think negotiations would be fairly easy. But not only have they not made that decision, I think they've consciously made the opposite decision, that they still want nuclear weapons. And until that decision and that objective changes, I don't think there's any real prospect for success. That's why what I call the Libya model of 2003-2004 reflected Muammar Gaddafi's clear decision that he didn't want to pursue nuclear weapons anymore. If Kim ever made that decision, the negotiations would be easy.
Mm-hmm. Then, based on your experience, when is the right time for the leaders of the U.S. and North Korea to meet? Is there any right time?
Well, I think when there's a new leader in North Korea, and this really goes to the basic point. For many years, both South Korea and the United States and other interested countries like Japan have pursued the denuclearization question. Some have talked about reunification, but it's always been very hazy. I have a view of reunification. I think it's reunification on South Korean terms. And I know people in Korea don't like the comparison with the two Germanys, but here's one place where the comparison is critical. When the wall opened up in Berlin and people from East Germany could go back and forth to West Germany, the East German state collapsed. So if there were true opportunities for people from North Korea to see people from South Korea, the state in North Korea would collapse as well. That's what Kim Jong-un fears. That's why he will never open up. So I think what the United States, South Korea, Japan, really the rest of the world have to do is go to China and say, look, you have unquestioned power in North Korea. You supply 90% or more of North Korea's energy. Your humanitarian assistance keeps the regime afloat. What you need to do is tell North Korea that it's time to revisit what happened in 1945. It's time to reunite the country. I think the United States needs to make the reunification of Korea on the right terms a central element of its China policy.
So you said when there's a new leader, there could be a summit between the U.S. and North Korea. You mean new leader as in not related to the Kim Jong-un regime?
Yeah. The key difference between North Korea and other rogue regimes that have sought nuclear weapons, like Saddam Hussein, like the Ayatollahs in Iran, like Muammar Gaddafi, is that really is an easy alternative to the Kim hereditary communist dictatorship, and its reunification. This is the analogy, really, between Germany and Korea. It is one country. The division of the Korean Peninsula is artificial. It was only intended to be temporary in 1945. Now, Kim Jong-un has a vision of reunifying the Korean Peninsula, too, on his terms, which obviously nobody on our side of this discussion will accept. But I think it's important not to be suckered into a discussion with Kim. Does he want economic benefits from South Korea? Sure. Is he really willing to open up in the same sense as opening a hole in the Berlin Wall was for Germany? Not a chance.
Let's move on to the Singapore Agreement. I'm sure the Biden administration, when they go through the review, of course, they review the whole Singapore Declaration. Do you think the Biden administration should embrace the Singapore Declaration?
Well, I don't think there's anything new in the Singapore Declaration. In fact, it simply marks yet another occasion in public, in a solemn agreement where North Korea has pledged to give up its nuclear weapons program, dating back to the joint North-South denuclearization agreement. But they just never get around to it. So one more empty promise from North Korea, I don't think really moves in the direction of actual denuclearization.
Some North Korean watchers say it could be a sound, proper foundation for the new U.S. and North Korean talks because it includes the complete denuclearization, normalization of the U.S.-North Korean relationship, and stable, lasting stability and peace on the Korean Peninsula. What do you say to that?
Well, I think there are a lot of very flowery words that I don't think Kim Jong-un believes. You know, Winston Churchill once said about arms control agreements, the only people you can trust to comply with arms control agreements are the people you don't need arms control agreements to begin with. So that's the problem with the North Korean regime. It repeatedly makes statements about giving up its nuclear weapons program, but never really takes tangible steps. Sometimes, for example, North Korea will do something like destroying the cooling tower at the Yongbyon reactor. But as anybody who knows how nuclear reactors operate, you don't need a cooling tower. You just discharge hot, not radioactive, but hot water into streams and lakes and kill the fish. The cooling tower is to minimize environmental consequences. It has nothing to do with the nuclear purpose of the facility itself. So that's a kind of Potemkin village, or actually reverse Potemkin village, that the North Koreans engage in all the time. It shows, I think, not that they're serious, it shows the exact opposite, that they are not serious about giving up the nuclear program.
Is there anything that Biden administration can inherit, should inherit from Trump administration's North Korean policy?
Well, I think one thing that North Korea tries to do all the time is split the government of South Korea from the government of the United States. Relations between South Korea and Japan are already difficult enough, so the North Koreans like to pose trouble in that relationship. And I think it's been a consistent element of American policy. And I think governments of South Korea have also tried to stick together. So and not let the North Koreans find gaps between their positions. Even though there can be legitimate disagreements, we have to stick together when talking to the North Koreans. So the United States now has a new president. There are elections coming up in South Korea. In democratic societies, governments change, and different governments have different perspectives. That's what democracy is. But despite the changes in governments, it's important that we discuss the differences behind the scenes and that we try and stick together and preserve a united front so that the North Koreans can't play games with us.
Mm-hmm. One of the key choices that Biden team needs to make seems to be whether they should adopt incremental, step-by-step approach towards North Korea's denuclearization. Do you think step-by-step approach will work?
No, I don't think step-by-step or action-by-action, as the North Koreans sometimes call it. It's gone through a variety of different labels, but it's basically the same approach. They make a promise to give up their nuclear weapons program, and they take one or two steps to carry that into effect, in exchange for which they get substantial economic benefits. Delivery of heavy fuel oil during the Clinton administration, similar kinds of promises during the six-party talks, and now they want the relief of economic sanctions. And so the other parties to the agreement give them the economic relief they want, and then North Korea stops making progress in denuclearization. And there's a reason for that. It's very straightforward. All of the heavy lifting on the North Korean side comes at the end of their agreement, when they someday finally destroy the nuclear program. But the benefits that North Korea gets are all at the front end. In today's case, for example, the lifting of economic sanctions would have an immediate and very positive effect on what's left of the North Korean economy. Once they get steady again, then it becomes easier to evade the remaining sanctions. Their economy is more stable, the military is happier. So they get the benefits up front, and the downside to them comes at the end. Because it's disproportionate, North Korea actually gains strength from the early stages of an agreement, and since they never make it to the later stages of the agreement, these action-for-action programs have invariably worked out to benefit North Korea.
Recently, you wrote an opinion piece. It was titled, "Biden Must Confront North Korea via Beijing." And there you said it is time for the U.S. to focus on China, and China must now own up to its responsibility. How can the U.S. press China to own up to its responsibility?
Well, I think for many years, the government in the United States, in Democratic and Republican administrations, has said China is working with us to find a solution to the North Korean nuclear program. They hosted the six-party talks during the Bush administration. They try and pose in the press as being helpful to try and bridge the gap between North Korea and the United States. And the U.S. has gone along with that. I think it's time to call off the charade. China has used North Korea ever since the peninsula was partitioned for its own purposes. I mean, we all remember that the two communist parties in China and North Korea used to say they were as close as lips and teeth, very, very close. And certainly in the early days, there's no doubt that Chinese assistance to and Russian assistance to North Korea's missile program and its nuclear program was very important. Now, both Russia and China deny today that they're aiding either the missile or the nuclear program. I have my doubts about that, but the assistance that they gave very early was critical. And given China's economic influence in North Korea, it could still call the shots if it wants to. So we're in a very difficult situation right now between the U.S. and China for a number of reasons, stealing America's intellectual property, probably stealing South Korea's intellectual property too. And so it's not an optimistic time, but it's precisely for that reason that China's responsibility for the existence of the North Korean regime has to be on the bilateral U.S.-China agenda. And I think that's what shows, again, why we need very close cooperation between Seoul and Washington. We cannot allow North Korea or China to try and drive wedges between us. But we also can't ignore the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that's that China is North Korea's lifeline.
I want to know what you think about South Korea's role as an intermediary between the U.S. and North Korea.
Well, I think South Korea really is not an intermediary in the sense South Korea is a direct participant in these talks. I think in a perfect world, what the United States would like to see is more cooperation with Japan. I understand the historical and political reasons, contemporary reasons that we're talking about. But the fact is, North Korea is a real threat to Japan. It's a real threat to other countries, potentially in Asia and the Pacific. And I think we all should be focusing really over the long horizon of the rest of this century on what we call a free and open Indo-Pacific. We've had very interesting conversations dating back even before the Trump administration with the Quad, India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. And President Biden just held the first summit virtually, but the first summit of the Quad. It seems to me there's room for many other friends to join the Quad. We're all worried about China. Nobody's characterizing this as a NATO. It's not a defense alliance. But it is an alliance, an informal alliance of people who believe in a free and open Indo-Pacific. So broader participation of South Korea in this emerging framework, I think, would also strengthen South Korea's hand in dealing with the North Korean issue, not just denuclearization, but ultimately reunification on the right terms.
Mm-hmm. Then overall, what should be at the core of the Biden administration's North Korean policy?
I think that North Korea is a threat to its neighbors and to the world as a whole. It's not just a threat in its capability of delivering nuclear weapons on South Korea or Japan or the United States. I think Kim Jong-un will sell nuclear weapons to anybody with hard currency. So I think North Korea is a proliferation threat that endangers the whole world. And I think eliminating that proliferation threat has to be the main objectives. I think the way that the U.S. and others have dealt with that threat for close to 30 years now has obviously not worked. During that period of time, North Korea has gotten closer and closer and is now very close to having the capability to deliver a nuclear weapon via an intercontinental ballistic missile onto the United States. How can using this approach again, which has failed for nearly 30 years, have any expectation of success? So I think the time is short, and I think that's why the concern about North Korea needs to be addressed, especially in the context of the U.S.-China relationship. That is where we can find a solution, and I think that solution ultimately is reunification of the peninsula on terms acceptable to the people of South Korea and having a free and democratic government across the whole peninsula.
Right. Going back to Trump-Kim symmetry, former President Donald Trump met Kim Jong-un for 3 times, and indeed, they seem to have some chemistry between them. But it didn't lead to the specific agreement how to reach denuclearization of North Korea, as you said it, and we all know it. Why do you think it failed?
Well, I think personal relations in international affairs have a role. They do have importance. No one can deny that. But they cannot change the basic interests of the countries involved. And I think Kim Jong-un, in particular, had a very clear understanding of what he thought North Korea's interests were, and he pursued them vigorously. And I think the gap between the countries was far greater than personal chemistry could bridge.
But still, Ambassador, what President Trump did with North Korea, it was nothing like we have seen in the past in the U.S. history. Some would call it very creative, others would call it very dangerous. Why do you think Trump was able to do that?
Well, I think Kim Jong-un must have been astounded when Trump agreed to meet with him. He got put on an equal platform with the President of the United States, and he gave up nothing. So, you can always make a deal if you give everything away, and that's what Trump did, I think, from North Korea's point of view. What Trump got out of it was a lot of publicity over the course of the 3 summit meetings, and Kim Jong-un got a lot of free publicity out of it too, making him a player on the world stage. But here's the real test in considering proliferation of nuclear weapons or chemical or biological weapons, which North Korea is also pursuing. Time is always on the side of the proliferator. Time is important to overcome the complex scientific and technological matters that have to be resolved in order to get deliverable nuclear weapons. So from Kim's point of view, time works in his favor. He doesn't need to test if he's already ready to produce. What he really wanted was relief from the economic sanctions because he knew they were squeezing North Korea very hard. Not because of the people, they were squeezing his regime very hard. And he was willing to trade the promise of denuclearization for economic relief. And that we would not give him.
So when you look back, from the personal relationship between the Kim and Trump, Kim Jong-un gained a lot.
I think on balance, there's no doubt North Korea won the 4 years of the Trump administration. They got legitimacy on the international scene that they didn't deserve. They didn't give anything up for it. And they had 4 more years to perfect their missile and nuclear programs.
This question is a little bit different. Earlier this year, there were allegations that South Korean government secretly planned to build a nuclear plant in North Korea. It was allegedly drafted around the time when President Moon Jae-in met for the first time Kim Jong-un in Panmunjom in April 2018. Was this ever discussed between the U.S. and South Korea?
Well, I don't think the story is true. Based on my knowledge, which may be imperfect, it would be a big mistake if any South Korean government considered putting a nuclear reactor in North Korea. It's why the agreed framework of the Clinton administration era and its deal with North Korea was so misguided. To give North Korea any additional nuclear technology in current circumstances is a mistake. So I hope and believe the story is not true. I guess time will tell.
Mr. Chung Hee-yong, then National Security Advisor for President Moon Jae-in, he refuted the claims, the allegations, and he said President Moon Jae-in was only giving Kim Jong-un USBs that contained new economic initiative for the Korean Peninsula. And he also said he gave you the same USB. Did you receive it?
Well, maybe one of his staff gave it to one of my staff. When I saw that story, I asked him. He didn't give it to me. He did give me a complete briefing. We used to talk all the time, and he came after the Pyongyang summit to debrief me and others. But the mysterious USB, I never saw.
Right. One of the biggest risks about North Korea is considered to be Kim Jong-un's health. The rumors come and go. You get fired up and then it gets dismissed later on. What is your assessment on his health?
Well, I don't think anybody can look at him and conclude that he's in good health. But I also would have to say, having seen both for him and for his father, certainly, and probably, although it's before I remember his grandfather, reports of a health incident. And there's wide speculation, and then it turns out he's okay. So one day there'll be speculation about bad health, and it'll turn out to be true. But I'm not wasting any sleep over worrying about it each time. I don't think North Korea has a clear plan of succession, and I think that's dangerous. I think that's one reason why this regime itself is a threat to international peace and security. Because if the regime collapsed catastrophically, we would have to worry about nuclear weapons being sold, being taken out of the country.
My last question today. What is the imminent threat that North Korea poses against the U.S.? Is it that it has a capability of ICBM, or is it proliferation? As you said, North Korea is Amazon of nuclear weapons.
Well, I don't think we have convincing reason to believe that North Korea's targeting capabilities are a clear threat yet. And we don't know for sure that a nuclear weapon can survive the reentry process. But we do know this. if Iran made a wire transfer of a substantial amount of money to North Korea, they could have a North Korean nuclear warhead within a matter of days. And so could anybody else with the same financial assets. So the North Korean threat to me is imminent because of the nuclear work they've done. We don't know, for example, whether under a mountain somewhere North Korea is not enriching uranium for Iran or for another country. This nuclear capability is very, very dangerous, and nobody should underestimate it.
Well, we'll have to leave it at there. Ambassador, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Glad to be here.
And that concludes the special edition of Washington Talk with Ambassador John Bolton. Thank you for staying with us. Please join us again next week for more analysis.